Brothers and sisters, we will inshallah be continuing with our TED-style talk today with Iqbal Asaria. Could we welcome him forward with a loud salawat? Iqbal Asaria is a trustee of SICM, and in 2005 he was awarded a CBE for service to international development. Inshallah, today he's going to be continuing with his series on the Silk Route, past, present and future. Salawat.
Assalamu alaikum. A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. This is our fourth talk on the Silk Route in this Ramadan, and the last one for this Ramadan. Maybe we take up some other time, inshallah, in more detail. So today we want to review very briefly what we did last 3 times. So the first time we talked about is the original Silk Route as the term originated. This is mainly about after 100 years after the coming of Islam, and we saw that the main trade route right from China to Europe in these continents was dominated by Muslims. Most of the countries in between were Muslims, and most of the trade was controlled by the Muslims. In fact, contrary to what people want to propagate, Islam is probably the only religion which was spread more by trade than by war. It was a trade-based empire. It was based on the idea of trade, exchange and development. And so you can see the route there. We also have another map of the same thing. You can see again the route and some of the sea routes. There is no European sea route at the moment. Most of these, as we know, traders from especially Yemen, Hadramaut and so on, they travel to the East African coast, to the Indian Ocean and into the Malaysia, Indonesia and up to Philippines by sea and then by road from the different Central Asian countries and so on. Most of this trade, apart from the small sailing vessels, was carried by either donkey caravans or horse caravans, so mostly animal led, and so quite challenging, quite difficult and quite long in their duration as well. Now what happened is that this continued for 700 years. In like 1450s, some of the explorers in Spain and Portugal, they started to put forward the idea that we want to bypass these Muslims and create a new route to the east. Of course, the main attraction of the east at that time was silk and spices. So I was in Dubai one day and I saw in a restaurant a small saying which was quite interesting. It says that, have you ever eaten any food without spices? And this tells you why the Europeans conquered the world, because they couldn't digest their food which they were eating. Anyway, this is just by the way, but it gives you some food for thought. Yeah, that you could try to conquer the world for just spices to make your meals. And silk, of course, silk was very valued. However, nothing lasts forever, and so we had slowly, through starting with Columbus, who went the other way, but then others who went this way, a discovery of the route around the Cape of Good Hope or in South Africa and up to India and then into Philippines and so on. Very soon, we had these people developing a completely alternative route to the east and circumnavigating the sea. Now, if that was trade only, that was fine, like the Silk Route trade. But this very soon turned into two major issues. One was slavery, and so you had up to 40, maybe 50 million slaves exported from Africa to North and South America. 10 to 20 million being killed on the way because the kind of transport ships and so on they had. All the plantations and everything else in those places were run by slaves. This is why still we know the Afro-American population, which is of course descendants of the slaves. And on this side also, they started to not trade only, but conquer the countries. So instead of trade, in addition to trade, it became colonization. Over a period of time, more and more countries became colonized. So one of the examples, for example, when the Dutch colonized Indonesia, they couldn't control some of the people in the north of Indonesia in a province called Aceh. Those people were very staunch Muslims and the Dutch couldn't really control them at all. So they captured them and transported them into exile as slaves into Cape Town, the south of Africa. Even today, you have what are called Cape Malays. These are the people who were brought by the Dutch there, and so on. And of course, the British went and wiped out the native population of Australia and conquered Australia, New Zealand. The Europeans went and wiped out the native population of America and finished the whole lot. Another 10 to 40 million Native Americans were killed or massacred or exterminated. That's why it is interesting that two countries refused to vote for an inquiry on the killing of Palestinian people recently. America and Australia. Both have done the same thing to their people, original people. So they don't see any problem in what Israel is doing at the moment. This is shameful, but it's still continuing, that kind of thing. So these new roots led to, of course, the eclipse of the Muslim roots and the coming of slavery. So we see, say in 1550, you had very few colonies. And then 1800, more. And then 1898, more. And then by the end of 1945, at the end of the Second World War, you can see most of the world is now colonized. There's no question of trade. Now it is obviously looting from colonies. However, as with before, nothing lasts forever. So now we have the question here. You had the beginning of European colonialism, as we saw. We had the emergence of the United States and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, which is what we used to call the Soviet Union, in the post-World War II era, and they wanted to control the world. But at the same time, Europe was beggared by the war, and so it had to give up its colonies. So we had independence in several countries, India, African countries, all kinds of places. And following that, we had the collapse of the Soviet Union, because the Soviet Union obviously had colonized the southern Central Africa, Central Asian republics, which were all Muslims. In fact, what is not known is that during the Second World War, Stalin helped Europe to defeat Hitler. Most of the fighting was done by the Soviet soldiers. But in return for that, Europe decided to turn a blind eye to what Stalin was doing to Central Asian Muslims. Tens of millions of Muslims were killed by Stalin in order to dominate his empire. But after Second World War, this started to slowly collapse. And once it was collapsed, Central Asians became freer. Now you have this Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Azerbaijan, and so on. But at the same time, with the collapse of the USSR, the United States became the sole power. So they called themselves, started to call towards the end of last century as a unipolar power. And people like Francis Fukuyama started to write books saying that this is the end of history. We have discovered that we will dominate the world, and there is nothing more for mankind to learn. We have found everything. We are the dominant power. But it didn't last for more than 20 years. Things started to collapse, and with the financial crisis in 2007-8, that myth was gone. So Francis Fukuyama is now writing a book, The Beginning of History, because the end was not there. So he is now trying to show us the beginning of history. However, in the meantime, there was the rise of China, communism in China, and then the coming of Mao, and so on and so forth, until China built itself up. And China is now becoming one of the dominant global trading and military powers, as we hear every day from the media and so on. At the same time, China itself is beginning to develop something which is very similar to the old Silk Route, because they want their own trade routes. They don't want these trade routes dominated by other people. So how does that look? And it's very interesting to see. It's very interesting to see how it looks. This is what they call the Belt and Road Initiative. Can we see the similarities with the old Silk Route? Right the way to Europe, and by rail, some of it by sea on this side, but mostly by rail, high-speed rail this time. So now the best we have achieved from China to Europe by sea is about 38 days through the Suez Canal. This thing, when it is completed, we'll see probably 9 days for transport. All the countries in between are still Muslim, and so we can see some possibilities of developing of a new world dynamics. Another map of the thing is here. If I can get this to work. Sorry. Yeah. You see? This is again One Belt, One Road initiative, which is China is saying. So this time also there is a sea component. And in fact, this map doesn't show they have gone that way. And China is talking to Mexico to build a rail at the slimmest point on the Mexican, where Mexico joins South America, that small point where the Panama Canal is. They want to build a railway there, high-speed railway, which will be better than the canal, of course. So the Americans are panicking that the Chinese are coming here in our backwaters. So the China is saying, this is trade, it's nothing to do with you. So let's get on with it. Now, at the moment, even in places like Kenya, for example, China has built a railway from Mombasa to Nairobi, already completed. And they are going to build from Nairobi to Addis and Nairobi to Rwanda via Uganda. So you can see that they are quite serious in controlling, in using these routes to promote trade. It is said that China has allocated $1 trillion to build this infrastructure. So for example, just in Pakistan, China has already spent $45 billion to create roads through the Himalayas back and drain roads and so on into other parts. They have started to build the railway from Tehran to Mashhad, new one. They have built another railway on the east coast of Malaysia. They have started building railways in Kazakhstan and so on. All these rails are high-speed rails. They want to accompany them with high-speed broadband internet access, information with highways. They are also, and they have developed, a very, very unique technology for power transmission, long-distance power transmission. So before, it was very difficult to transmit power over long distances because the transmission losses would be such that you couldn't control. Now they have developed, I don't want to bore you with details, the new way of transmitting that it can transmit power over very long, large distances. And they have global power transmission stations now. So what they are doing is putting in place an infrastructure which can carry trade. The idea is this. About 30 years ago, when I was in India once, I was in Mumbai, and I wanted to call somebody in Calcutta on the other side of India. So those days, obviously, it's not like just you pick up your mobile and dial. You had to call an operator and say, can I speak to so-and-so number in Calcutta? So she said, yes, sir, wait. I will put you through to London, and then London will put you to Calcutta. And so I'm talking to Calcutta, Mumbai to London to Calcutta. Now, anybody who knows anything about telephony, you know that every termination attracts a cost. So London was taking twice the money than the Indian operators from Mumbai to Calcutta. All the value add was being captured by London. Similarly, today, if you have your Apple computer, you see that most of it, if not all of it, is made in China. However, 20% of the cost stays in China, 80% goes to other countries, to Apple and so on, yeah, distributors, advertisers, and so on. So the value extraction is still very much in favor of non-Chinese, in this case, countries. If you want to balance the value extraction, you want to say, okay, we want to get as much value as we can. So, for example, if you look at a cup of Costa coffee, how much it costs you? £3? How much is the coffee in it? Cost of coffee? No, cost of the coffee inside, the coffee beans, huh? 5p? So who takes a $2.95? So what about the coffee grower? It's irrelevant, right, in terms of cost. We are not capturing the value. What this initiative is designing to do is to see if we can capture more and more of the value. If you capture more of the value, somebody loses that value.
Isn't it just being transferred from the west to the east?
Of course. So now you can see, if you read every day, Mr. Trump is saying, you are robbing us, because some of the value is now going back. And if the routes are also going to be different, passing through countries which we can identify with, we can see that things are going to change over the next 50 years. Change, like those historic changes I have shown you, again, to something else. We don't know what. The question is this. When America dominated the world, we had a problem. Will we have the same problem if China dominates the world? This is the big question for next Ramadan, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum.